In this video, we'll take a look at the firmware migration from Enterprise to MPP using classic licensing via Cloud Upgrader. The first thing we need to look at is the licensing that needs to be purchased per each phone for the firmware migration from Enterprise to 3PCC. If we are using 8800 series phones, then for each phone we must purchase one of the following licenses: the L-CP-E2M-88XX-CNV =. So one of these licenses is needed per each phone of the 8800 that we're migrating from Enterprise to 3PCC. If it's a 7800 series phone, then we need to purchase the L-CP-E2M-78XX-CNV license for each phone that we're migrating from Enterprise to 3PCC. The document you want to leverage when doing the firmware migration, and definitely this is something to look at even before starting the firmware migration project, is there's a white paper that covers a lot of the details as far as licensing, hardware eligibility, and also other additional notes that are very helpful for firmware migrations because there can be different types of caveats. In any case, you want to take a look at this link right here. This document does get updated from time to time as things change with the firmware migration methodology and as far as what's supported, what's not supported, etc., etc. The next thing we want to take a look at is if you need support from a firmware migration standpoint. There's really three different groups to consider from a support standpoint. So if it's dealing with licensing, then typically you would be looking at the global licensing operations team. So let's say you just ordered licensing and you're having issues retrieving your licensing or issues with just the licensing in general. Then the global licensing operations team would be generally the folks you would want to contact, and you would want to leverage this link right here to open up a case with them. If this was a subscription type of situation, where you had a subscription to licensing, which in this case it does not really apply because a subscription for this firmware migration is not offered, but let's say you were doing it in reverse, you were going from MPP over to Enterprise, there is a subscription offered for that migration, and let's say you were having issues with your entitlement, then you would want to go ahead and contact the entitlement folks right here, which is listed as MCE, so Cisco Entitlements. And then if you're having issues with the physical phone, so for example, issues with Dhcp, issues of getting the alternative Tftp configured on the phone, issues with the phone and VLANs, etc., etc., then you'll want to contact the small business support team using the following URL for support. And then the last item on this page is very critical to be aware of. I'm going to read this verbatim. Question is, my customer purchased the wrong phone type and needs to migrate the phone to the call controller they have. Can we do this? And the answer is no. Please contact point of sales to return the phones and order the proper phones for the customer. Cisco will not replace the phones or migrate the phones for the customer that makes a mistake when ordering the phones. So what this is basically saying is you want to be very careful before placing an order for the phones to understand, are the phones to be used with, for example, like WebEx calling or third-party call controller? If that is true, then you want to order the 3PCC phones, also known as the MPP phones. If the phones are specifically for call manager, CUCM, then you want to order the phones with the enterprise SKU numbers that have the enterprise firmware, if you will. So be very, very careful because this can be a very, very expensive mistake. And again, this information sourced from the white paper that I referenced earlier, that we have the link here. It does get updated from time to time. Leverage it if you're working on a firmware migration project. Definitely read this very carefully to understand caveats and other things to be aware of to minimize issues in your project. And then the other thing you also want to take a look at is eligibility. Which actual phones are eligible for the firmware migration? Because there's certain phones, and I'll point out a few here, that have a minimum hardware requirement to be eligible for the firmware migration. So for example, if you look at this phone right here, the 7821, it must be a minimum hardware version of V03, version 3 basically. Then similar to that, the 7841 needs to be version 4 or higher as far as a hardware version. And then the next one, the 7861, it needs to be a minimum of version 3 or higher for it to support the firmware migration. So again, just be aware, and you want to always take a look at this document, the white paper that we've been referencing so far based upon the link. It does get updated from time to time just to make sure when you're doing your firmware migration, when you're watching this video at that point of time, is this information still accurate, or has there been any updates as far as what is supported, minimum versions of hardware, software, etc., etc. The site we're going to be using for performing the firmware upgrade is the upgrade.cisco.com site, also known as the Cloud Upgrader site. And once you get to this site, what you would do is you would click on this section right here where it says Enterprise to MPP, and then in parentheses it says for Broadwork/other 3PCC or other third-party call controller. So once you click on that, what that gives you is basically this additional extension for the URL, which is the page we're at right here. And the key thing to note is, as of the recording of this video, when we migrate the phones using the classic licenses, using this Cloud Upgrader site, the phones will eventually migrate to MPP firmware 11.3.6 as listed here. And also, as of the recording of this video, this happens to be the same firmware that WebEx calling is using online. So one of the first steps we basically want to do is, I talked about the licensing, so we must purchase one license per each phone that we're going to migrate. And then once you purchase the licenses, you're going to get an email, and then an email you're going to have to associate that license with the specific MAC addresses of your phones. And then once that's completed, you will get a physical file with a .lic, a .lic extension. And this is where you want to upload that physical .lic file or files depending on how many phones you have. So this is a very, very critical step, and it is a requirement. And then as far as once you complete this step, the next item is determining which method of migration you want to do. If the phones are already registered to CUCM, you can do bulk migration. This site has very good documentation on how to do bulk migration using CUCM. Phones are registered already with CUCM. So this is good, again, if you have phones registered CUCM. You have a lot of phones, you probably want to use this method. What I would recommend highly is only first do 1 or 2 phones as a proof of concept to make sure everything works correctly with the workflow within your environment. Once you've proven, testing 1 or 2 phones that it works correctly, then do them in batches, but do them progressively. Don't do a lot in a single batch. Start off with a smaller batch of like 5 phones or so. Validate they've migrated and everything looks okay. Make sure physically folks are on site, so if a phone has any issues, there's somebody physically that can go up to the phone, take a look at the phone if needed to reset the phone back to factory default, etc., etc. And then progressively, maybe do 10 phones in the next batch and so on and so forth. But also be careful not to overcommit yourself in doing so many phones. If something goes wrong, then it's going to be very difficult to recover from. So again, as with most things in IT, it's a balancing act. And then the other two methods we have that we can leverage is bulk migration with Dhcp. So phones are in a staging facility, meaning they're not registered to CUCM, but you have, a decent amount of phones you need to do concurrently or in batches, and you want to basically have a methodology. You can just plug the phones into a network and just have them start migrating. And then the last one, which is the one I'm going to show, which theoretically is the simplest because there's really not much to it, as you'll see in this video, is manual migration, lab, proof of concept, and several devices, meaning you just have like 1, 2, 3 devices, few devices. The other thing that's very important is going to be network accessibility from the phone's VLAN or network segment to the internet. So this is very critical. If you're in a high secure environment, this could be a roadblock right here. Before you even are able to migrate a single phone, you may run into this issue. So you want to make sure from a firewall proxy standpoint that we basically have this site cloudupgrader.webex.com open specifically for ports 6970/443. And then the other site is going to be activatecisco.com, ports 443, and then activation.webex.com, ports 443, or port 443, I should say. And then from a general network requirements, we want to make sure there's DNS so the phones can resolve those addresses and or URLs. And then also we want to make sure that obviously the VoIP VLAN has internet connectivity, which kind of ties into this first part. And then also we have the proper DHCP options based upon a methodology we've chosen, as we talked about previously. So in this case, we're going to be really focused on the last methodology, which is the simplest. And then one of the things that you need to look at is what is the current firmware on the phone you're migrating. As of the recording of this video, these are the actual minimums of enterprise firmware the phones must have for the firmware migration to work. So you notice some of these actually very old versions of firmware. So for example, like the 7811, 7821, and so on, it's a 10.3.1.12 firmware, which is extremely old. Likewise for the 8811s and so forth. I generally recommend not having such old firmware. Typically, if I'm migrating from enterprise firmware, I find it best for the phones to be like a 12.8 or something like mid-12s or above. Currently, like the 12.8s is pretty good. The one thing to be aware, and that we'll look at in a few moments here when we actually do the firmware migration via the phone, is currently the way the upgrader.cisco.com site is set up, and also the way the firmware migration methodology is set up, is the phones are now bypassing what is known as a transitional firmware. So they're going directly from enterprise firmware to 3PCC firmware, which is great. It saves a whole step, less risk of the phone getting stuck during a firmware migration, etc., etc. But the phones need to be at a minimum of 14.1.1 or 14.1 parentheses 1. So what this tool is going to do, what the Cloud Upgrader is going to do for us, it's going to actually bump the phone up to 14.1.1, even though the phone might have a lower firmware. And then once it bumps it up to 14.1.1, it's going to go directly to 11.3.6 MPP firmware. If you're in a situation where you're doing a lot of phones and there's limited internet bandwidth at that location, you may want to bump up the firmware locally using like a local Tftp or CUCM, whatever your situation is, to 14.1.1, and then perform the firmware migration using the online tool like the Cloud Upgrader, because then half of the step of the heavy lifting will be done locally, where it just really boils down is how quickly can the phones ingest the firmware, when they're updating to 14.1.1 from the local TFTP server / CUCM. And then the only other step that it will be doing as far as actually leveraging the bandwidth on the internet would be going from 14.1.1 over to 11.3.6. So just something as a consideration. So in this procedure, what we're going to do is we're going to press the settings button. It has a little gear icon on the actual phone. And then once we basically press that on the phone, we're going to go down to admin settings within the phone TUI, telephone user interface, LCD basically on the phone, then network Ethernet setup, then IPv4 setup, and then on this we're going to scroll down a tab on the page. We're going to come across a setting listed as alternate TFTP. We're going to make sure we have it on/yes, and then right below that the TFTP server 1 will light up, and then we can start entering the following IP address: 3.14.211.49. We're going to hit apply, and then if we're prompted for a trust list is installed on phone, do we want to erase it? Yes, we want to erase it. So this is very important. If your phone had been registered to CUCM, then definitely step 4 is something you need to do. Okay, we're going to go ahead and do the actual firmware migration on the phone. First, let's take a look at the current firmware on the phone. And we're going to notice it's 12-8-1 firmware, so that's a pretty good firmware. It's not too old. It meets the minimum requirements. So now we're going to go to the actual Cloud Upgrader site. And we're going to go into the section for migrating from enterprise to MPP firmware. And then we're going to scroll down this page a tad here. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we need to go ahead and upload the license for this phone. So again, this is referred to as classic licenses. One needs to be purchased for each phone. Okay, so it shows we have success. Excellent. Okay, now we'll actually take a look at the phone itself. So we're going to go under settings. We're going to go down here on the menu, admin settings, network setup, Ethernet setup, IPv4 setup, and we're going to go down until we find the option for alternate TFTP on. And for TFTP server 1, we're going to actually type in 3.14.211.49, and we're going to apply. And we're going to wait here a little bit. Sometimes it can, this can start going within very quickly, 10, 20, 30 seconds. Sometimes it may take a minute or two. So we're just going to leave it alone here for a few moments. And if you're having issues with this, as I mentioned earlier, you definitely want to look at the connectivity between the phone network segment, the VLAN the phone's in, if you have like a VoIP VLAN, and the servers, the URLs and ports that were listed in a document we looked at earlier, to make sure there's actual connectivity so the phone is able to reach out and be able to resolve the IP addresses of the URLs we looked at earlier, and it's able to handshake and basically pull down the needed information. A lot of the information will be encrypted, so what you'll notice is, even though in certain sections, you know, it may be using TFTP, there'll be a lot of HTTPS, but the actual payload will be encrypted, so it'll be really difficult. Okay, so we just got a counter here, ready to upgrade. Device will restart in X amount of seconds, so that's good. So that wasn't too long, maybe 45 seconds or a minute or so we waited there. So we're just going to let this go. And what we should see is we looked at the firmware the phone had before we started this. So it was enterprise firmware 12.8. And as I mentioned earlier, with this new firmware migration method, as far as under the hood what the phone does with the Cloud Upgrader, it's going to bypass the transitional firmware. However, for it to be able to do that, it needs to be at 14.11 enterprise firmware. Since we're starting with a phone that's below 14.11, the first step that the Cloud Upgrader is going to do, it's going to bump the phone up to 14.11, And once that's completed, then the phone will actually start downloading the MPP firmware, also known as 3PCC 11.3.6, and then it'll go ahead and reboot, and it'll be basically, it'll come up in runtime of 11.3.6. So in any case, so we'll take a look at here. We should be able to catch it before it does the next stage of what version of firmware it has. And okay, so let's take a look at it. It looks like it'll give us some time here. So we're going to go under System Information, and then we're going to go down here, and as you see, it's 14.1.1 Enterprise firmware. And the phone, by the way, that we're using for the firmware migration is a speakerphone, at 8832. It's a little bit different than the other phones, but the actual same steps and the same behavior you should see with the other phones when doing firmware migration. So we're just going to leave it on this screen. We're not going to touch anything else, because we should fairly surely see activity where it starts doing like the part 2 of the firmware migration, which would be to migrate it now from okay, there we go. Here's the countdowner. Ready to upgrade. Device will restart in X amount of seconds. But in any case, so this next stage is going to now migrate from Enterprise firmware 14.1.1 over to MPP firmware 11.3.6. And it's going to be roughly the same amount of time. Generally, what I've found with these firmware migrations, generally it's about 4.5 minutes, 5 minutes for each one of these segments. I'm only doing one phone in this situation. Obviously, if you have a lot of phones, it's going to be based upon the constraints of your internet connection. So this is something probably you want to do off of peak hours in a maintenance window, especially if it's a larger type of deployment, because you do want to give yourself extra time if you run into any issues with certain phones, that you have enough time to troubleshoot those phones. And that kind of comes back to a comment I made earlier. You want to first do a test run with 1 or 2 phones to make sure this works end-to-end, the workflow from start to finish point in your deployment situation for the firmware migration. And then you want to start off doing progressive batch sizes, like a small batch of like 5 phones, make sure that goes through nicely, and then maybe bump it up to like 10 phones and make sure that works, goes through nicely, etc., etc. Okay, looks like the phone is rebooted now, and in a few moments we'll go ahead and check on the phone to see what the actual firmware is listing. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll take a look at the phone here under Settings, and then we'll go down here to the Status, Product Information. Okay, so we notice it's 3PCC at the end of the actual phone product name, and then we'll notice the version now is 11-3-6 MPP. Excellent. So basically we've completed the MPP firmware migration. So at this point of time, the phone would be basically ready to be added to the call controller. Oh, by the way, this is the enter activation code. This is if you're going to be adding it to WebEx calling. But in any case, hopefully this video has been helpful for the firmware migration. Thank you for watching.